build-up to the U.S. election context and aftermath have been quite dramatic and revelatory. For an assessment of the winners and the losers of the scenario, we're joined by Professor Chika Mordi, adjunct professor at SAIS Johns Hopkins University, one of the two best institutions for public policy and international affairs in the United States of America. It's a pleasure having you, Professor Mordi, this morning. The winners and the losers. Who are the winners and the losers? The institution, the over 70 million people that voted for Donald Trump, or the list is endless, or Joe Biden? Who are the winners and the losers? I'd like to hear from you. I mean, you wrote a very spirited article, I should say.
Yes, I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed, yeah.
Well, good morning, both of you. Thank you for having me. And I must say, the last time we spoke, a lot has happened since then. It's been a very extraordinary period. For the winners, I have 6 people. Well, I should say 6 winners. So I have President-elect Biden, obviously. I have COVID-19, believe it or not. I have the Republican Party, that's the GOP. I have Black Lives Matter movement, the U.S. electorate, and Stacey Abrams.
Stacey Abrams. And the losers?
For the losers, I have President Trump, QAnon, pollsters and pundits, the people like us who do that for a living, progressive Democrats who some self-refer to as socialists.
Proud Boys?
And I'm going into details into each of them.
Okay, you want to add Proud Boys to that list, or QAnon, we do it for Proud Boys?
And the QAnon is an umbrella that they all subscribe to.
Yes, that's the whole gamut of far-right types. So you wanted to go into everything, I'm sure, but I wanted to talk to you about Joe Biden's mandate now, which is uniting the country and also uniting the party. So I actually want to start on the losers column with who you have placed there, the progressives in the Democratic Party. How is he going to manage that? Because that is another issue that could arise in his presidency. We've seen so far the people that he's appointed, subject to Senate confirmation, of course. But do you think that there's room for more of the left end of the spectrum for portfolios like education and housing and health and what have you to keep the peace within the Democratic Party?
Very good question. It's a very difficult balancing act, balancing both tensions, the tensions within the party and the tensions of the greater country. So typically you see a candidate pivot from the primaries to general election. So they move typically to the more extreme end of the party during the primaries. And once they get the mandate, they have to pivot to the overall country. And the governing mandate is similar. There's a lot of space. Obviously, Biden himself is a moderate, and he ran as a moderate. But he has to, the other wing of the party, the progressives, he has to sort of bring them into that governing coalition. And there's very limited room for error. He will certainly pick a couple of progressives. His speaks so far are not progressive. But like you rightly mentioned, there's some areas where he can, like education is one of those obvious areas, and some form of regulation where he can bring in the progressives. But even then, there's some challenges as well. If you pick a senator in a state that is competitive or a state where the incumbent is a Republican governor, then it's likely they'll send someone to the Senate who is a Republican, and that could further complicate his governing agenda.
Right. I want you to know why you said the Republican Party was part of the winners in all of this.
Yeah, it's a good question. You're going to think, well, they lost the presidency, so why are they winners? They're winners because down ballot, they overperformed and they had a much better position than the last election. So the Senate, in all likelihood, is going to be retained by the Republicans. I can predict now that they will probably pick up both seats in Georgia, which will get them to 52, which is just one shy of where they were before the election. Now, most people, including Republicans, expected to lose the Senate. The House, yes, they lost that, but they gained a larger number of seats, and it's down to a 9-seat deficit from the most recent projections. Most importantly, at the state level, the state congresses, they retained and even expanded their positions. Now, because 2020 is a census year, it's going to be very critical to determining the electoral maps and the congressional districts going forward for the next 10 years. And Republicans are in the driving seat for that process.
So I have a question for you, Professor. How to lose an election, a comparative analysis between your winner, Stacey Abrams, and your loser, Donald Trump. Discuss for 10 marks.
Well, I hope you're going to give me an A+ grade and not a D.
Oh, let's hear it.
Let's hear it.
I think Stacey Abrams is an excellent example on how to organize, and also in terms of the winner's attitude. So Stacey Abrams, some of your viewers would know, had run for the governorship, the gubernatorial elections in Georgia, and she lost. But she wasn't daunted. What she did was to go back and begin to organize at the grassroots level for the party and build structures that paid off, first of all, in 2020, and it's going to pay off going forward, because she brought in people who had never been registered and maxed out, well, not quite maxed out, but dramatically increased in terms of turnout in Georgia. And she went beyond that. In fact, Biden owes her not just Georgia, but if you go to Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, in the large cities there, the Black-dominated cities of Philadelphia, of Detroit, and to an extent in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, she increased the turnout as well. So this is how to win an election. If I contrast that to the loser, to be fair to President Trump, he worked very hard. He brought out more voters than any presidential candidate had ever done before this year. Unfortunately, he also managed to upset sufficient voters for 80 million of them to turn out to vote against him.
All right.
A+.
Anyway, I will not have to score you, Prof. But real quickly, I want to know why you said COVID-19 was a big winner. And I also want to juxtapose that with rhetorics of Trump and groups like QAnon saying, don't wear a face mask. It's all a ruse. Don't believe this thing about coronavirus. And the increasing numbers lately, America had another new high yesterday.
It's really unfortunate and it's tragic, the issue of the face mask and COVID-19. Now, COVID-19, I say, is a winner because in the build-up to the election, President Trump basically stopped governing. Not only was he not actively undermining the message of the CDC and the efforts at curbing COVID-19, but he stopped providing leadership. After the election, he's completely zoned out. So you're not seeing any effort coming from the White House in terms of COVID-19. So COVID-19 during this period has expanded. The second wave was hit not just the United States, but also Europe as well. And we're seeing greater infection levels than ever before. And we're seeing greater hospitalizations, and the daily death toll is rising as well. So in that sense, COVID-19 is a winner. There's been a massive, massive misinformation campaign, some of it deliberate, some of it inadvertent, but making masks the cultural war and trying to deny the severity and even the existence of COVID-19 has had tragic consequences for the country. And when you think about it, the president himself got hospitalized. He had a severe case of COVID-19. If that wasn't convincing enough, then what could be?
Indeed. Now, what does the Biden presidency mean for Africa, bearing in mind that Biden was right to reject Hillary Clinton and Obama's idea, well, they're blamed for the Libyan incursion, which we've seen was something of a disaster, removing Muammar Gaddafi and failing to stick around until he's replaced. Nature abhors a vacuum. What has happened has been the growth of violent extremism, which we are paying for here in Nigeria. What will he do this time around? And obviously the appointment of Anthony Blinken, who openly admits to the United States' failure with Syria.
It's interesting. When you speak to the Biden people, they like to take the credit of the Obama-Biden presidency. But when things are wrong, they tend to point out that actually Biden wasn't in charge, that President Obama was in charge. But having said that, I think it's going to usher in a new era of U.S. and the world, actually. How the U.S. engages with the world is going to change. You're going to see a more engaged America, an America that realizes its place in the world and plays that role. And for those of us in Africa, I think in many ways it's a good thing. The team he's assembled are very competent, very seasoned people who have an international orientation. And a lot of them have experience specifically with Africa. And so you're going to see increased provision of support, increased efforts at economic and political relations on the planet. And for all that is said about how Obama perhaps failed to curb the full extent of radical Islam and the terrorism that comes from that, let's not forget that they were not shy about deploying lethal force when they had to. And I think the landscape has changed a lot. China has become a much larger and influential player than they were. And policy makers in the U.S. realize this, and they're going to take steps to increase the relevance of the U.S. on the planet and deploy the three forms of power that they would use here. So I say it's a plus for us. You're not going to hear irresponsible and reckless comments like referring to our country and other countries as S-hole countries. That is for sure.
All right, real quickly, I'm excited you mentioned China, like Donald Trump will say. and let me take a Tundu-style kind of question. I'll mention these two countries, and you could just help me walk through how America will have to navigate their relationship with these countries in this new era. China, Iran, and Brexit Britain.
Okay, now you made that three and not two.
Okay,
so
three, yeah.
We get or two. That's always a good bargain. I think if we start with Britain, it's pretty obvious that Britain is America's perhaps closest ally, not only in Europe, but on the globe. And you can tell already from how Prime Minister Johnson was engaged in the British Parliament at Westminster that people expect that relationship to get closer. Now, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump were allies, at least on the face of it, but they didn't quite share a lot of philosophical understandings. And if you remember, there's an incident where some presidents were laughing at Donald Trump, literally. President Trudeau in Canada and Macron in France and Boris Johnson. They have a lot of respect for Biden. Britain needs the U.S. as it starts with Brexit and has to negotiate trade agreements and hopes that the impact of Brexit will not adversely affect U.S.-UK trades. So you're going to see a closer relationship, especially in NATO and in terms of climate change. These are issues that the British want to do, but Trump didn't quite agree. Trump was not very supportive to NATO and to climate change, which he basically denies. Now, in terms of Iran, again, you're going to see a constructive engagement. Constructive does not mean that Iran and the U.S. will suddenly become friends, but they're likely to reestablish the regime that existed in terms of the global and the legal regime for nuclear proliferation, where Iran would open up itself to inspections and will put a brake on the development of their nuclear aspirations, I should say. Now, China is perhaps the most complicated. So it used to be before Trump, which seems like so long ago, that Republicans were free trade advocates and their dealing with China was the trade wasn't an issue. Free trade for them worked. And Democrats were the ones who were against free trade with China because it affected union jobs and they were concerned about that. Trump inverted that. So Biden comes in sort of following on the idea of fair trade with China and trying to work to deal with what they accuse China of, which is mercantilism and the rest of it. But at the same time, he has a clear direction of it, and it's not going to be the sort of capricious policy making we saw with the Trump regime. Now, militarily, China, of course, is a different China from what it was 8 years ago. They're a much more powerful adversary. And if you look at the recent trade agreement that was signed in the South Pacific, the U.S. was not part of it. So militarily, you're going to see greater assertiveness, and you're going to see greater trade engagement to get better terms.
You've described America as the most imitated democracy. Should it be? Looking at this embarrassing attempt from the Trump administration to subvert the will of the people and this churlish letter from the General Services, administration deigning to allow Joe Biden to have what is actually his right. And also in the Nigerian context, do you think that a presidential system with a bicameral legislature like America is right for us? Briefly, as we round up.
Okay, let me unpack that. There are three components in that question. The first one is, yes, the U.S. democracy has been strained, and even as we speak, the guardrails have been tested, right? But it appears that the worst might be over. It's a 244-year-old democracy. It's had a peaceful transition throughout this period. No other country has that. So to that extent, it's a role model. Now, can it be improved upon? Definitely. There are arcane provisions that can be revisited to strengthen those guardrails. But so far, it's worked. The judiciary has been intact. They've been very objective in the judgments they've made so far, which is why President Trump is yet to win any case that would meaningfully impact the election so far. Now, the second part of your question, you talk about for Nigeria. Personally, I think Nigeria's political structure is very expensive, maybe to elaborate. We can't quite afford it. It's time to begin to rethink a lot of those elements, not because of what is going on in America right now, but because of the economic reality of having such an unworldly and large system. A unicameral legislation would be cheaper if the numbers are reduced, and it would begin to make more sense. And even the federal structure we have now can be revisited, because it's no use having so many states when they're not self-sufficient and where the states themselves are not sufficiently empowered to reflect true federalism. And the last part of your question, one positive and one winner I had in this election is that the U.S. electorate engaged. You had a much larger number of voters as a percentage or in absolute terms. That is a positive.
Indeed. Thank you so much for joining us today.